Alright, my speech today is going to be on, is water wet? Try to lighten the mood a little bit. It's a bit of an older conversation, but I'm putting it back up. As you all may know, there has been a debate on a grammatical and scientific issue that usually collides with each other when proper terminology is not used. The debate may seem a bit odd and honestly completely stupid. It's something that's not really thought about on a daily basis until it's brought up like it did on the internet. My speech today will be on whether water is wet or not. For those of you who don't know this topic, the idea that water is wet is a grammatical and scientific error. To keep consistency, we'll refer to these two definitions. The definition of dry, which is free from moisture or liquid, not wet or moist. And wet, which is an adjective used to describe something that is covered or saturated with water or another liquid. If we refer back to the definition of water, water cannot be saturated in itself, it would just be water. So, the same idea goes for fire. If fire burns things, but it's not in and of itself burnt, why would water be wet? So by the definition of wet, which is the condition of being covered or soaked in liquid, then water isn't wet, it just makes other things wet. Just like fire burns other things, but not itself. Water isn't simply wet because grammatically saying water is wet is redundant and not necessary. Wetness is a description of our experience of water. What happens to us when we come in contact with water in such a way that it imposes on our state of being? We, or our possessions, get wet. A less imposing sense of experience of water is that it's cold or warm, or while visual experience tells us it's green or blue, fast-flowing or muddy. We learn by experience that a sensation of wetness is associated with water, but that is not the case. If you have a fish in a bowl of water, this fish is not wet simply because that is the air state in which it lives in and is not surrounded by air. Whereas us humans are surrounded by air and when come in contact with water, become wet. If you take the fish out of the bowl, it becomes in contact with water and it becomes wet, for it is now saturated in water, surrounded by air. This air-to-water contact is what makes something wet. Once again, it is a condition that we which learn to understand. The opposing side of this argument would say that the water is wet because wet can be used to describe being doused in liquids such as beer, milk, juice, urine, etc. All these, however, are water-based. Can wet be used for a liquid that has no water? Can you be wet by mercury? That would be a whole new conversation for a different time, but simply put, mercury can get you wet because wet pertains not just to water being in saturation with something. Water is not water-based, but instead just liquid, thus can be saturated. Another idea that's rare to develop on your own is dry water. Dry water, an unusual form of powdered liquid, is a water-air mixture in which tiny air droplets, each the size of a grain of sand, are surrounded by a sandy silica coating. This powdered liquid was originally used in cosmetics and now help transport explosive gases around without accidentally detonating. This is not really dry water because 95% of the powder is water and the other 5% is the silica surrounding each droplet. In order for something to be dry, you have to remove that part that makes it wet, which is water. Water was never removed, only covered. Let's recap what we've covered today. Water is not wet because 1. The adjective of wet describes the surface of something being covered or saturated in a liquid, such as water that is typically dry. 2. The idea of being wet is something that was learned in association with water, but water in itself is not wet, just as hot and cold are not actually hot or cold, only mental emulations. And lastly, 3. To say that the water can be dry or elements such as liquid mercury cannot be wet misunderstands the terminology of wet. Water is not wet. Thank you.